Welcome. Thank you for all of you who are joining across the country. So I can say good morning to some of you and good afternoon to others. My name is Bill Dempster from 360 Public Affairs, and I'd like to thank CanCertainty co-founder Bob Bick, who will be joining us on this panel, for tapping me in to help organize and moderate these sessions, which are getting well known as the Hot Topic webinar series. So Bob will give you a bit more information about that. Today, we're going to revisit a topic that CanCertainty has been very active on over the past couple of years, and that is non-traditional endpoints in cancer. As many of you on the line know, many emerging cancer treatments, especially those to treat early stages, rely on surrogate endpoints or non-traditional measures, which are not overall survival because, well, we're going to learn more about that very shortly. Regulators like Health Canada increasingly accept non-traditional endpoints for drug approval. However, they may pose challenges for provincial payers and health systems as they evaluate the long-term value and funding decisions. So this webinar will explore how Canadians treated for early stage cancer or early stage or curable cancer perceive and value these surrogate outcomes. Panelists are going to present some findings from a study supported by CanCertainty that examines patient perspectives on non-overall survival endpoints and discuss how these insights can strengthen patient group contributions to the health technology assessments process. I'm just going to start sharing slides here so that folks know a little bit more about what we're talking about. Let's make sure I pull up the right deck. Share, there we go. So a couple logistical points. Please note that this webinar is being recorded, and we're going to upload both the recording and the slides to CanCertainty social channels, and that will be on YouTube and SlideShare. If you or others have registered for this this session, then you're going to get a link to those channels, so you'll be able to watch it offline again and again. In terms of our panelists, and I'll just introduce those briefly. We're going to start with Bob Bick, co-founder of CanCertainty, and many of you know him as one of the most knowledgeable Canadians in the patient and market access space. Sheila Szabo is also a co-founder. She's co-founder of Broad Street Health Economics and Outcomes Research, where she serves as scientific director and CEO. And she has 15 plus years of experience in health outcomes research and consulting. And as we'll talk about, there's actually very recent data that's just been published that she's going to share. She publishes regularly in peer-reviewed journals. Dr. Stephanie Snow is medical oncologist at the QE2 Health Sciences Center and professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax, where she treats thoracic and GI malignancies and is very involved in advocacy and health system leadership. I've already been on a couple of calls with Stephanie today, and many of you will know her through her leadership at Lung Cancer Canada, but also at the Canadian Association of Medical Oncologists, and on the advocacy committees there. So what are we going to do? Bob is going to talk a little bit about why this is an issue. And then we're going to pass it over to Sheila, who will review some very recent data in terms of patient and caregiver perspectives. We're going to throw it over to Stephanie, who will give her thoughts in terms of why the clinicians care about this issue and actually talk about a case study. And then we'll have an open discussion on Q's and A's and a call to action. One more logistical point I wanted to bring up, and this is for all of the attendees that have signed on, really encourage you to use the chat panel and the Q&A panel. Don't wait for us at the end. I'll be monitoring that as folks are talking. We'll bring as many of those Q's and A's forward for our discussion with the panelists. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Bob. Bob, you tell me when to go to the next slide. Tell us, why is this an issue?
Well, I'll also go to the next slide right off the bat. So this is an issue because, in the last decade, there's been a huge number of new cancer medications that offer great opportunities to battle cancer, with good safety profiles, but they're using increasingly clinical endpoints other than overall survival. These are, like disease-free survival or, progression-free survival or patient-reported outcomes. Next slide. but it poses a huge challenge for us as we go forward with drug evaluation. So just to give you a size of the magnitude of this issue, a couple of years ago, IQVIA conducted a study that focused on interventional clinical trials for the top 10 tumor types for early stage cancers. And when we started doing the analysis of this with IQVIA, about 60% of the qualifying trials in the trials they identified in this particular area used a surrogate outcome measure as a single primary endpoint. And a further 28% of those trials had multiple primary endpoints that included surrogate outcome measures. So we're not talking about over 3/4 of trials are now using surrogate endpoint measures for early stage cancers. So that's a huge challenge for us. Next slide, Bill. So we can see that there's in the 10 tumor types that we were talking about in the last slide, there's a huge utilization of these endpoints in a lot of these tumor types. We see it primarily here in breast, lung, and prostate, but of course it's starting to emerge in a lot of other cancers as well. Next slide, please. So my basic concern here at CanCertainty is that we have to prepare our patient groups to adapt to the challenges that we're going to face in securing reimbursement for these treatments. Health technology assessment organizations are, as we know historically, not always the quickest to adapt. We can all remember how long it took for progression-free survival to be accepted in health technology assessment as an endpoint. And we have to ensure that we don't have that same delay and lag going forward. Otherwise, we're going to see significant delays for patients accessing these therapies. So the study you're going to hear about in the next little while examines patient perspectives on these non-overall survival endpoints. CanCertainty's goal in all this is to support our patient groups in the future to help them when they're doing their contributions in the HTA process to be able to address these challenges and to utilize this data to actually challenge our HTA organizations to accept these endpoints. So over to you, Sheila. Oh, you're on mute, Sheila.
Yes.
Sorry,
There we go.
after the sound check and everything. Perfect. Thank you very much. So thanks, Bob, for that introduction. And I'm really happy to join everyone today and share the findings of our recent initiative to understand patient perspectives on this set of surrogate outcomes that are becoming increasingly commonly used in oncology clinical trials. If you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Perfect, thank you. So this study that I'm going to describe represents a collaboration between CanCertainty, Dr. Stephanie Snow, Aya McMillan through Rethink Breast Cancer, team members at AstraZeneca and my team at Broad Street, as well as the 33 Canadians treated for cancer who so willingly shared their experiences and perspectives during this study. And a manuscript describing this study is being published this week in the journal Cancers. Next slide, please. Thanks. So for context, historically, overall survival, or OS, has been the gold standard for measuring health outcomes in cancer clinical trials, and it is defined as the time from randomization, measured from when you start a medication in a clinical trial, until death from any cause. Like Bob said, OS is a measure of treatment efficacy that is well accepted by regulatory decision makers. Its use is widespread, and it has a very standard interpretation, so it makes comparing efficacy across treatments and cancers easier. It is also intuitive and well understood by clinicians and patients. However, for assessing new therapies in early stage cancers, there are some challenges to the use of OS. Next slide, please. These include that to measure OS, we need to follow patients for their whole lives. And in early stage cancer, this is difficult because luckily treatments may be curative and patients are younger. OS is supposed to measure a treatment's effect, but the results can be influenced by factors other than the treatment being studied. In early stage cancers, survival time can be affected by relapses, other treatments used, or the impact of other health problems. And finally, survival is not the only way to measure a treatment benefit. Patients and clinicians also value quality of life, the impact of side effects, and levels of physical function, factors that OS does not directly capture. Next slide, please. So as Bob has noted, due to these limitations to OS data, endpoints beyond OS are now being included in early cancer clinical trials, and they can provide timely measures of treatment efficacy earlier than estimates of OS would be available. So those regulatory agencies like Health Canada or the FDA consider this evidence from trials involving these endpoints when approving medications for more widespread use. So examples of these endpoints include recurrence-free survival, disease-free survival, event-free survival, and pathologic complete response, and you can see definitions for those on this slide. The first three of these reflect very similar concepts. They measure the time from starting a medicine in a clinical trial until a clinically important event, but that clinically important event differs. So for recurrence-free survival, that event is cancer or death, cancer recurrence or death, sorry. For disease-free survival, cancer incidence or recurrence or death. Event-free survival is a little more complicated, but reflects things like the time to disease progression, cancer incidence or recurrence, or death. And then pathologic complete response differs, and then it reflects whether there is any evidence of cancer after something like a biopsy at one point in time. So while these endpoints measure clinically relevant events, there is presently little data to show how these endpoints relate to OS. For example, if a medicine has longer disease-free survival, we don't yet have data on OS from this same medicine to be able to understand the relationship between disease-free survival and OS. And because of these and other considerations, non-OS endpoints are not yet widely recognized by HTA agencies, reflecting the reality that HTA bodies and healthcare payers face about what's called the OS impasse, where they need to figure out how to weigh potential benefits of new therapies against financial considerations and established value metrics. So efforts to understand how HTA representatives feel about these endpoints are ongoing. Next slide, please. But in addition to understanding HTA views, it's also important to understand the perspectives of people with cancer on non-OS endpoints, as endpoints used in clinical trials should be patient-relevant and meaningful. However, data on how people with cancer view these endpoints are also currently limited. Understanding the perceived value and limitations of these endpoints from a patient perspective is important to ensure that assessments of the value of new cancer therapies reflect the priorities of patients and their families. So to understand these viewpoints, we conducted a study to explore the perspectives of Canadians with early stage cancer on the perceived value of non-OS endpoints. Next slide, please. So in this study, we recruited Canadian adults treated for early stage cancer or treated with curative intent through CanCertainty, as well as a healthcare recruitment partner, Global Perspectives. Participants were eligible if they had been treated or were being treated for early stage breast cancer, non-small cell lung cancer, small cell lung cancer, or selected gastrointestinal cancers. And during qualitative one-on-one interviews, we discussed treatment patient experiences before reviewing the endpoint definitions. To do that, we shared explanatory graphics like the one on the right-hand side of the slide to help participants understand the endpoints, and then solicited their perspectives on the strengths and limitation of each endpoint and how those endpoints aligned with their treatment goals. So in addition to sharing the graphic, we also reminded participants during the interview that there was presently limited information to link clinical benefits of non-OS endpoints to an OS benefit. And then we analyzed the data using reflexive thematic analysis, which is a form of analysis that can identify patterns and responses across individuals, and then we constructed themes to explain these. So patient feedback contributing to themes is highlighted using direct patient quotations. Next slide, please. During the study, we spoke with 33 participants. 64% of them were female. The average age was 55 years. 85% were white. 75% had a college or university degree, and they were recruited from throughout Canada. 12 participants had been diagnosed with breast cancer, 11 with lung cancer, and 10 with gastrointestinal cancer. And all participants had received at least some treatment for their cancer. 85% had received surgery, 79% chemotherapy, 49% radiation, and 33% other treatments. At the time of the interview, 18 participants reported no evidence of cancer, and 5 participants reported a relapse or recurrence. Next slide, please. From the interviews, we learned that OS is an important and patient-relevant endpoint, but it does not tell the whole story. Participants found the endpoint easy to understand and recognized its use provides a benchmark to compare how different therapies perform. OS resonated with participants as survival is one of the main goals of treatment. As a participant with lung cancer said, it helps you plan for the rest of your life. If somebody says to you, you have 1 year to still be alive, or you have 10 years to be alive, I think you would behave differently. You would pack those 10 years in 1 year and do everything you wanted to do. OS has importance for what you want to achieve in your life. However, participants did recognize some drawbacks. As we have already discussed, OS can take a long time to measure, and it can be misleading in early stage cancers where it does not account for competing risks of mortality. And more highly personally relevant for participants in our study, they felt that OS measures the length but not quality of life, and that survival without good quality of life isn't desirable by most. As illustrated by this participant with liver cancer who said, it's a funny word, survival, because that captures the essence of everything you're asking, really. Are you just looking to survive, or are you looking to really lead a completely normal and healthy life going forward? And where is the gap between those two things? Next slide, please. We then discussed impressions of the non-OS endpoints and the varied reasons participants suggested as to why non-OS endpoints offer value from the patient perspective. We will note that participants didn't obviously distinguish between very similarly defined endpoints like recurrence-free survival, disease-free survival, and events-free survival. So for that reason, we're talking about them collectively. Participants did distinguish between those endpoints in PCR, however. Next slide, please. Perfect. So the first reason that participants valued non-OS endpoints is that the information measured within these endpoints represents meaningful constructs that are relevant to patients. And this is important as one of the underlying canons for measuring outcomes in health is that we are measuring what matters, especially to patients and their families. Participants highlighted to us that one of the reasons these endpoints matter is that they align with many patients' treatment goals. Many early stage patients have goals of being disease-free, stopping cancer progression, avoiding relapse and side effects, maintaining quality of life, and essentially kicking it to the curb, which aligns with the clinical results conveyed by non-OS endpoints. As one participant with liver cancer noted, quality of life can vary a lot. So I think what everyone wants is to get back to normal. And the best way to do that seems to be to get rid of the cancer. I think everyone would prefer a treatment that has the best chances of doing that. And another participant with liver cancer said, I wanted treatment to essentially make me disease-free, so I don't have to go through the same thing again in a few years' time. Sometimes when you just climb that mountain and there's another peak you have to climb again, it's just like, not again. I can't do this again. So yeah, it's very important to be able to anticipate what comes to the future in this disease. Next slide, please. Participants also valued non-OS endpoints because they felt the information measured within these endpoints can provide valuable additional clinical detail in which they would personally be interested, specifically clinical details on the risk of recurrence and disease-free status. In addition, they noted these results can provide hope and optimism. So as a participant with breast cancer said, I'm not going to have to worry about being off work and finances, barring other things in my life. I'll be around for my kids now that they're older, and hopefully I can see them have kids. And I can think about retirement, all those types of things. Even though the overall survival might not be any different, I know that, okay, but the next 10 years should look awesome. Next slide, please. An overarching theme for why these endpoints matter to participants is that timely and equitable access to effective treatments can save lives. So participants wanted access to cutting-edge treatments that they think might better meet their treatment goals. They also valued wider access to avoid inequity and understood that the use of non-OS endpoints may help achieve this. Participants were invested in access to novel treatments that showed meaningful improvements in quality of life and non-OS endpoints, even in the absence of OS data. As one participant with breast cancer noted, I think that in our system, drugs in clinical trials take way too long to get approved. It's hard to see things that are available to people in other countries that should be available to us here, but you can't have access unless you have money. And a participant with lung cancer said, definitely I would say to decision makers that at the speed at which the science is going, if you're waiting, as you wait, the cost is the lives of people. And yes, there is uncertainty with, for example, disease-free survival. But waiting for a very long time to make drugs appear, as somebody who has cancer, it's a little bit crazy. And so I think this really highlights that for many, access to treatment is a race against time. So it was not all rosy. Participants did perceive some drawbacks to the use of non-OS endpoints in early stage cancer. These included that while offering more information than OS, non-OS endpoints still do not capture all aspects relevant to patients with early stage cancers, for example, quality of life while on and after treatment. In addition, using non-OS endpoints may mean there is less available information on long-term treatment impacts that are important for patients to understand their prognoses. And finally, there's the potential that a treatment measured to the standard of non-OS endpoints in early stage cancers may not meet the expectations of all patients. For example, if a new treatment doesn't improve OS and also has a worse quality of life impact than other available treatments. So, as one participant with lung cancer said, I think one of the biggest challenges is false hope, right? If there is this mindset that it's probably going to lead to longer overall survival and people go into that expecting it, and then it turns out that's not the case, I think that emotionally and psychologically that would be very hard on patients, especially if the quality of life is that much harder. You put your body on the line in the hopes of having these benefits, and if they don't materialize the way you expect them to, I wonder how much people would suffer, not just physically with symptoms they weren't expecting, but emotionally for not getting the benefits they were hoping for. Next slide, please. Finally, we wanted to note some factors that we found influenced perspectives on the importance of non-OS endpoints in early stage cancers, in particular age, diagnosis, and cancer stage. For example, younger participants or participants with better prognoses saw a cure as possible, and having treatment options which provided a better quality of life was therefore a primary goal. Compared to participants with poorer prognoses who more highly valued survival and having treatment options that reflect or would allow subsequent lines of treatment. The treatment options available for the type and stage of cancer influenced perspectives on risk and innovation in treatments. And for those who had families or wanted to have families, treatment goals often factored that into consideration. So, as a participant with breast cancer said, I think if you're talking to someone diagnosed stage 4 or who has had a recurrence, I think the perspective changes. It's not about not having the cancer come back, it's all about how long can I live. And from another participant with breast cancer, I know many, many other young women who have gone through breast cancer, especially those who had children. They were willing to do everything, like throw the kitchen sink. And it did not matter what the studies showed. If you had equal chance of survival doing a double mastectomy versus a lumpectomy, they chose the double mastectomy, needing to feel like they did everything they could to survive. Next slide, please. So this study explored the importance of cancer trial endpoints beyond OS among individuals treated for early stage cancer through the lens of their own treatment goals and priorities. We found that participants highly value survival, but felt that measuring OS does not tell the whole story of how patients do while on treatment. Despite recognizing some limitations to non-OS endpoints, nonetheless, participants valued these for representing meaningful constructs that are relevant to patients that highly align with their treatment goals. Also, participants valued the additional clinical details these endpoints convey. Participants were invested in access to novel treatments that demonstrate meaningful improvements in quality of life and avoiding recurrence, even in the absence of OS data. And demonstrating the value of non-OS endpoints was very important to patients because of this idea that timely and equitable access to treatments can save lives. Next slide, please. So, as Bob noted earlier, this research was conducted to help clinicians, researchers, and regulatory and reimbursement agencies better understand the value of non-OS endpoints to patients and to help patient groups have the data they need to have these discussions with HTA. Patients view non-OS endpoints in early stage cancers to measure constructs reflecting their treatment priorities, and they feel that data collected on non-OS endpoints may be considered as sufficient evidence of efficacy for them to want to access those treatments. So for future research, we should seek to validate these findings among people with other forms of cancer or who live in other jurisdictions, and expand on these findings to quantitatively understand patient preferences for these endpoints from a larger number of people with early stage cancer. So these findings provide evidence of the patient-perceived value of non-OS endpoints to inform healthcare decision-making, and also highlight the impact of patient context and experiences on treatment goals and endpoint preferences.
Thank you, Sheila.
Stephanie.
So I'm going to take over now and give you my perspective as a clinician. And I really wanted to try to, talk a little bit about how we can take these concepts and apply them when we're taking files through to HTA. but also I do a little case study to maybe make it a bit concrete about the implications of being able to use these surrogate endpoints other than OS actually in a Canadian situation. So next slide. So non-traditional endpoints are very important. And really, when I think about what's the value as a clinician, but also as a patient advocate, as somebody who has now authored probably more than I can count clinician submissions to originally CADITH and now CDA, there's really two things that I always try to highlight and focus on when we're talking about a file that is going forward using not necessarily OS, but one of those non-traditional endpoints. First of all, we know that early indicators of efficacy are something that we have our hands on earlier. If you have to wait for a patient to actually pass away, it takes longer for those trials to mature and actually get the OS. And having to wait for a treatment that really is effective means that we're not having access to something that's truly saving lives. And so when we know that these early indicators are actually predictive of OS, it's really important to make sure that that's part of our submission, that we talk about those things. So one of the best examples is in colorectal cancer. When the first trials were coming out in adjuvant colorectal cancer, so when we were using chemotherapy after a curative intent surgical resection, looking primarily at stage 3, so node positive colorectal cancer, we clearly found by looking at the data from the mature trials that the disease-free survival at the 3-year mark was highly predictive of a benefit of overall survival at the 5-year mark. And 5 years is really a gold standard in colorectal cancer. I tell my patients, if you make it to 5 years, that's when you go book the Legion or book the hotel room and have a big celebration, because that's when we can start talking about cure if you're 5 years out from your original surgery. And we clearly showed with that evidence. So now for any kind of colorectal, file that we go forward with, we can always reference that data. And so that's one of the most important things, is they actually are pretty good at predicting when we look at the data. It's going to differ between what endpoint and what cancer, but they have that value, and that they probably will be able to predict who's going to have an overall survival benefit. But what's a little bit more subtle, but I also think is very powerful, is the intrinsic value of these endpoints and what they're measuring standalone. So, I mean, this is something that really patients inherently understand when you're looking at things like quality of life. Obviously, quality of life is very important for patients. And if you talk about a treatment that maybe means they will not live longer, but they will live a longer period of time living without cancer, that has huge value, because your life with you're living with cancer often is characterized by symptoms from your cancer. You're likely on treatment, so you have side effects from treatments, and this has not just an impact on you as a patient, but on the caregivers as well. And also from a societal perspective, if you are living without cancer, then you're able to be a contributing member of society. You can work and pay taxes and do all those things, whereas somebody who's still alive, if their cancer came back earlier, may not be able to do those things. And finally, the healthcare system, there's value there too. We know that once patients have their cancer back, even if it was inevitable it was coming back, that they're going to be starting to use the healthcare system and costs. They're going to be trips to the emergency room, to physicians, getting their treatments, getting more scans, those types of things. And so there's also a value to the healthcare system for time living without cancer. Now, many of the submissions that I end up authoring and co-signing are for lung cancer targeted therapies, these little oral pills that often can cross the blood-brain barrier and work quite effectively, not just to treat cancer that started in the lung and is spread to the brain, but actually to protect lung cancer from appearing in the brain. It's what we call protection, where you take these medications and people who go into a trial with stage 4 cancer, we can delay or even prevent the day in which they develop brain metastases. So whenever we have a file and we know that that oral drug that they're looking at has activity in the brain, we always quote the same paper. It's a wonderful paper that was written actually showing the impact of having brain metastases in lung cancer patients and that impact on quality of life. And so when we're trying to, talk about quality of life, we're like, this drug might help you live longer and delay recurrences and delay how long until your cancer gets worse, but also it can protect your brain. And once the cancer goes to your brain, that has huge impacts. And we have that literature to review. So having that literature out there is absolutely invaluable. And we kind of cut and paste it between our submissions because the same point applies to many, many cases. One other key point I wanted to mention here is that sometimes trials of highly effective therapies will never actually formally show a final overall survival benefit. And there's many reasons for this. It's very ethical and I think appropriate for trials to be designed with a crossover perspective. So for instance, you've got your novel therapy and your standard of care therapy that are being compared in a randomized trial. And a crossover design means that the patient who's receiving the standard of care on progression, they are able to cross over and get that experimental, that novel therapy. And so sometimes if you get this crossover, you don't ultimately see those patients are living longer. Now, they may have gone longer before they progressed. They may have had a much longer time with a better quality of life if the novel therapy is better tolerated, but that final overall survival can be attenuated. So another great example here is in bowel cancer, where there's a subset of patients with metastatic cancer that we call MSI high or mismatch repair protein deficient. Bottom line is we know that these patients are incredibly sensitive to a class of drugs called immunotherapy. And the first registrational trial of immunotherapy in this setting was a comparison between pembrolizumab, a really commonly used immunotherapy drug, to standard chemo. And there was a very impressive progression-free survival benefit. We knew it was going to work really well in this population, but this trial very appropriately allowed for crossover. And so in the final OS readout, it wasn't statistically significant. But we all know as clinicians, just inherently, of course, this is going to be an effective therapy. And sometimes if they just looked at the OS, that means we would have no access whatsoever to immunotherapy. So I'm really glad they didn't make that choice in that particular case, because this is funded in our standard of care. There's also, even outside of trials with crossover designs, availability sometimes of these same therapies or similar therapies after progression. And so you may not get crossover in a trial like that where you get the immunotherapy from the trial, but you may have been able to get access to immunotherapy in a second-line trial or some other way. And those things can all attenuate overall survival, which certainly doesn't mean that they're not the best treatments, but because we just don't look at one treatment in time, we look at series of treatments and trajectories of therapy, sometimes that can muddy the waters. Next slide. So I wanted to take what I could think of as the most dramatically illustrating case to really kind of drive home the impact of when these non-traditional endpoints are used to drug approval in Canada. Now, this is an example from non-small cell lung cancer in the curative intent, and as people who are attending are maybe very well aware, lung cancer is the most commonly diagnosed cancer in Canadians, men and women combined, and also is the #1 cause of cancer deaths in men and women. So a huge, huge problem on the cancer field. Now, the curative intent treatment for this cancer is whenever we can to cut it out. But we do know that for patients, if they undergo a curative intent surgery, they have very high rates of relapse and then it's not curable. Now, a subset, about 15% of lung cancers that are non-small cell lung cancers that are not of the squamous histology, so that's the more common type of cancer that we're talking about here, will have driver mutations. And the most common driver mutation we find in this population is something called EGFR. Now, in this trial, they looked at patients who were known to have the EGFR mutations that predict for sensitivity to targeted therapies. They said, okay, if we've cut out a stage 2 or 3 cancer, meaning the tumor is bigger than 4 centimeters, or there's lymph node involvement, after that, and if you needed to get chemo, you finished your 3 months of chemo, there was a randomization where patients either received osimertinib, which is a highly effective EGFR targeting therapy, and of note, a very well-tolerated treatment for most patients, 1 pill a day, very minimal side effect burden, very manageable side effect burden almost always, versus placebo. And this was a hugely practice-changing trial. It first read out, this is the slide from ASCO 2020. This is one of the ASCO plenary presentations that most of us watched online, because this is just when COVID shutdown was ongoing, May of 2020. And Dr. Roy Herbst put up this slide, and it was groundbreaking for us as lung cancer treaters, because here we see the disease-free survival in blue for the patients who are getting the active therapy osimertinib. And so to understand this graph, as the curves kind of go down, that means patients are having a disease-free survival event, in most cases recurrence of their cancer, or they could have passed away or have been diagnosed with another non-small cell lung cancer. Now compare that trajectory to that of yellow, the placebo group. So right from the beginning, those curves are separating. And we definitely saw a huge benefit statistically. When we look at the hazard ratio, it's 0.17. So that means there was an 83% reduction in the risk of their disease coming back. So there was no way that anybody could look at this data and really not think that this was a beneficial treatment. And as soon as we saw this, we want this for our patients right away. And obviously patients knew about this and they wanted that as well. And if you lived in the US, it didn't take long. Later on in 2020, the FDA approved it and they started using it. But it was a bit of a different story in Canada. So let's go to the next slide. So Health Canada has to approve the drug. Then it has to go to our HTA bodies. At that time it would have been CADTH, but now CDA for all jurisdictions except for Quebec that has a NES. And then after a recommendation for funding, it has to have a price negotiation, and then each jurisdiction, the provinces have to pick it up. And this process, which is a whole different topic that I'm also very passionate about, can take a long time. So this is what happened, is what it looked like in Canada. So May 31st, 2020, we had the presentation at ASCO. On March the 24th of the next year, the file was submitted to CDA. Later, at the very beginning of 2022, there was a final recommendation to fund based on that disease-free survival data. And the first province outside Quebec to list was Ontario, and that was 898 days later. So that took a long time, but at least we had it. Next slide. Now, it was later on, June 4th, 2023, another plenary presentation for Dr. Herbst at ASCO that we saw the OS. This is the final analysis for OS was read out with mature data. And here we see that, yeah, lo and behold, it does translate to a very effective therapy. Here we have a hazard ratio for overall survival of 0.49, so a 51% reduction in death. We see a very significant difference at that 5-year critical mark. And these are patients who have now finished their adjuvant course of therapy and are on nothing and still maintained. If we had waited for this overall survival data and then taken it to HTA, and it still took the same amount of time to go through HTA as it did, which probably would be because things haven't changed that much, we would not actually even have access to this yet. We would expect the first listing to be later on this year, November 18th, 2025. Meanwhile, thousands of Canadians have been treated with funded osimertinib. We have saved thousands of lives already because we had early access. And this is, I think, a great example of how using DFS truly saved lives and allowed us to have access to an incredibly life-changing therapy for many patients. Next slide. So there's a lot more that we can do as clinicians and as advocates and as researchers to really make sure that we are providing those who are having conversations with HTA and HTA bodies themselves the tools that they need to appropriately use these non-traditional OS endpoints. First of all, healthcare providers, we need to write these HTA submissions. We have to make sure they know about this data, about what happens when you get brain mets. They need to know about the data that's out there, and to make sure that that's run clearly and very directly brought to their attention. When you get that email from CDA that says, will you please be a clinical expert on this file? And sometimes it's a lot of work and we're really busy, but you should say yes, because this is your chance to make sure they truly understand some of the medical and day-to-day clinical perspectives that really, really can be impactful on decisions. Also, we are the gateway to the patients and the caregivers, which is very important for HTA submissions, and I understand will become even more important in the CDA process. We're really going to focus on patient perspectives throughout the whole trajectory of their assessment process. But we need to be able to identify the patients who've had access to the therapies, who can tell their stories. We need to help them to tell their stories. And a lot of our advocacy groups do that by helping them frame with the right questions and make sure they're getting their points across. As researchers, we need to continue to do work, just like I talked about, that colorectal data work. 3-year DFS clearly was predictive of 5-year OS. Actually doing the study so we can say, look, we have proof. If this is a neoadjuvant lung cancer trial, we'll throw all of those trials together because there's a lot of them, and we'll start showing how pathologic complete response rates on the surgical specimen truly did translate to OS as we get that data, and hopefully we can translate that to newer trials coming out in the future. We also really need to work to get quality real-world evidence that includes patient-reported outcomes. And I think this is so important because the patients that go into clinical trials are not necessarily representative of our whole population. We know they're more likely to be younger, higher socioeconomic status, a higher education level. We saw the same thing in the research that we just talked about, our project with Sheila. I mean, our patients were in their 50s and most of them had a university degree. That's not your average patient. They were much younger and higher educated. And so when we're talking about the impact of things like quality of life or ability to work, that benefit may actually be over exaggerated once we start talking to people who are living in rural areas and lower socioeconomic groups. And if you actually are coming from a higher socioeconomic group, it may not make a big deal if you have to be off work or if you've got a great job that has disability insurance and sick leave. But if you're working part-time at Tim Hortons, that can make even more of a difference. And so I think that getting those real world pros can actually show that sometimes these patient-reported outcomes from trials may actually be the tip of the iceberg. Finally, we need to conduct more research on the HTA processes and show the impact of the decisions and how that had impacts for patients, how many lives have we saved, years saved in terms of that. We've definitely seen that for the timing, but also when we look at those endpoints, but also for the system. Because all those patients that I showed you in my little case study who've not had a recurrence of their cancer, they're saving the system a ton of money. And you know what? On recurrence, they all would have gotten that osimertinib drug anyway, so they would have had to pay for it eventually. So why not give it to them up front and hopefully actually cure more patients? And so when we put dollar signs and actually showing that value, it's not that we're asking you to spend more money for something that's going to, you know, have a tangible benefit that's not measured in nickels and dimes. It actually can save the system money fine as well. And finally, we need to capture that patient perspective. That's why I was so excited to engage in this research with Sheila and the group, because sometimes we assume as clinicians and advocates that we know what patients want, but if we don't actually ask them and we don't actually capture that, sometimes we don't realize that we might be surprised. And there may actually be a significant difference in what patients value and what we think that they value. We've seen that a little bit in some lung cancer research we've done, so I think we need to really continue to do this direct research with patients. I think I've probably gone over my time, but I'll pass back to Bob now. And as you can tell, I'm something I'm very passionate about.
Yeah, this is the time where we open it up to Q's and A's, and I've got a couple that, of course, I'm going to bring one to Bob first, and then let the others weigh in about a little bit more about the research. But I'd encourage the folks on the line to use the chat panel to weigh in with your comments and questions as well. A question that we did not prepare for, but I think is important. You know, it goes back to your earlier stats, Bob, about all of these new medicines coming to market that rely primarily on non-OS data. Is that in part because these are used for earlier stage cancers? A lot of the medicines that were coming to market were for stage 3 and 4, but are some of these medicines coming up earlier in the line, and so you might not know what the impact would be of either the medicine or something else in terms of somebody's life or death. Like, what's the issue here? Why are there so many medicines coming without this OS data now? And maybe this is more of a question for Stephanie, who's the clinician on the call. You're on mute. You're on mute. Mute. Oh, he provided a beautiful answer just there.
I'm just going to say, part of this is a pragmatic. I mean, as Stephanie mentioned, it would take a very long time for overall survival data to read out in a lot of these cases, because a lot of these patients do not have the, or early stage cancer or perhaps cancer free, and they're being treated in the adjuvant setting. So for an overall survival readout, it could take many, many, many years. And again, I mean, there's a pragmatic reason why drug companies want to use something that can measure results earlier, because they might be approaching the end of their patent period. There's a pragmatic reason for that as well, but there's also an actual urgent reason for patients as well. When you have a demonstration of benefit, do we need to wait? It really stood out to me in Stephanie's presentation, where there was that comment: not having to wait saves lives, and also potentially saves money. I think was also a nice little follow on that. But it could take just too long for overall survival data. But I'll pass over to Stephanie to sort of go on that.
Absolutely. So from a clinical perspective, this is a really exciting time. And I mean, the number of drugs that are theoretically available for my use compared to when I started my practice, I'm mid-career. I like to think I'm not quite senior yet. There's so many more. We really just had chemo. I was a medical student when the very first targeted therapy for lung cancer was even discovered for EGFR. And now we have so many different therapies. So as we've had this explosion of targeted therapies, of immunotherapies, that we start off studying in the metastatic and the incurable setting and they work, we quickly want to move them to the curative intent setting because I don't want to use these drugs for patients I can't cure. I want to cure these patients. And so I think that whereas when I had to study for my Royal College exam, there were like, maybe 5 or 6 major trials for each cancer indication I had to learn. I am not jealous of the students who are coming through now. They have so much to learn. And every single Congress, it just used to be ASCO and ESMO, but now there's all this GISCO and GUSCO and all these other things. And there's practice changing data coming out all the time because we have more drugs that are more effective. And I think that's part of the drive as well, because we're really moving things that are effective into that curative intent setting. And unfortunately, we're also seeing more and more cancers. We're getting better at screening. So for instance, right now in Canada, we're seeing slowly but surely rollout of lung cancer screening. And what we're really going to hope that shows is less patients being diagnosed with incurable stage 4 disease, more with stage 1, 2, 3 disease that we can treat for cure. But that means that it's more of an interest. There's more of these patients at earlier stages. And so that's really driving, I think, a lot of the urgency. Plus, we have drugs that work.
Yeah, so that's really the why. In terms of the how, and this is for Bob and Sheila. I mean, how could this new data and the learnings from patient perspectives on non-OS outcomes be used in an upcoming HTA submission that patient organizations are bringing together? What's the real utility here from the recently published data?
Sheila, do you want to go?
Sure. I think that was so I think that it's really important, like we've done in this study, to use rigorous methods to document patient feedback and patient perspectives. And I think what we often hear from HTA representatives, and I don't want to put words into people's mouths, but I think what we often hear is that they just kind of struggle to know what to do with these data. And part of the reason they've struggled historically is that people view this kind of evidence as a bit anecdotal. They're not sure how well the patient representatives who are speaking represent the breadth of experiences. So I think what we need to do is multi-pronged. So as researchers, as clinicians, as advocates, we need to generate patient-derived evidence using the best methods to convince HTA representatives about their rigor and their credibility. And I hope the example we presented today is a great example of that, of using really kind of high quality methods and trying to present this information in a way that's easily digestible. At the same time on the HTA front, there needs to be revisions in their processes, and those processes or those kind of revisions are ongoing, because right now there isn't a really easy place to slot these data into like a model that they're used to seeing to be able to see the impact on the outcome. So like Stephanie was saying, CDA is changing its policies, many other HTAs are, and to figure out how we can incorporate these data more in the deliberative framework in how people talk about the decisions that are being made rather than in a model per se, and to really kind of for the HTA representatives to come together to give clear guidance about what they want these data to look like and how they will look. So as researchers and clinicians and advocates, we can respond with the best quality evidence for that
Right
framework.
on. And Bob, you've been involved in this project. Some of the methodology that Sheila brought to this, are you going to be using that? Because you're very involved in a lot of HTA submissions for patients and helping coordinate the clinician submissions as well. Is there anything that you've learned from this project that you're gonna build on going forward on those submissions?
Absolutely. Well, I'll be working with Broad Street to develop an actual package for our patient groups for the Cancer Certainty Coalition, so that that'll contain the conclusions, the summary data, key messages, all sort of like encapsulating the how patients value these endpoints and how important it is to patients to bring in that different perspective, that it's not always about survival. And so I mean we'll be preparing the package so that can be reused in patient submissions for all of our of the the CanCertainty member organizations, so they can use this data to great effect when they're doing their patient submissions for treatments that are under review that are using these surrogate endpoints. And I just also want to comment that, Sheila mentioned about, that there are revisions of the process that are ongoing. We're also at CanCertainty trying to change a bit of the culture of the HTA process as well, right? I mean, they're very, because their main customer is frankly the payer, the provinces, they're risk averse, right? They are when they see something that presents uncertainty, they get very, very cautious and conservative. And there are lots of different ways of dealing with uncertainty. And there's shared risk models with the manufacturer, et cetera. So I mean, we're trying to push for different changes in culture, not just in processes as well, to be able to absorb some of this this uncertainty that these new endpoints present to the process.
Yeah, excellent. Sheila, something that struck me from the data that you presented was that patients and caregivers are actually they don't speak with one voice. They don't have one perspective, depending on their own goals in life, their life stage, and where they are in terms of the cancer. Um, how do you think HTA organizations and evaluators are going to deal with that heterogeneity of perspectives? Because is there a worry that they could sort of cherry pick and say, well, this is not important?
Yeah, and I think that's a really great point. And heterogeneity in perspectives is exactly the right way to characterize that. I think this kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier about dealing with this kind of in the study design phase for generating patient-derived evidence. So when we just have a few patient representatives in the room, that heterogeneity, that breadth of experiences isn't being represented. I think that kind of speaks to the value of the kind of research that we have done together, in that it does let those different voices kind of shine through. And I think that speaks to kind of what HTA will need going forward, which is really expanding beyond the very kind of clinical and economic focus that they've traditionally taken, to get more non-clinical trial evidence from manufacturers, researchers, and patient groups that could include, for example, patient feedback, like in our case study today, that's talking about the variability in patient experiences. But then also making better use, like using those same kind of methods with active physicians with real world treatment experience who can kind of share this back to HTA. And like Stephanie was saying, help with the interpretation of those kind of crossover design issues, but talk about what they're seeing in the real world. So for the HTA process to really broaden, to take into more of this kind of wider focused patient evidence rather than just looking for one or two people to speak on everyone's behalf.
And Bob, when we first started on this journey, in terms of understanding, reviewing non-traditional endpoints, it's been a couple of years now. There was almost a global playbook that was starting to emerge. Started with the FDA in terms of how they were reviewing these, in terms of efficacy measures that were not OS data, starting moving to PFS, et cetera. Do you have any update in terms of what's happening at the global level? Who's moving on this? And then bring it back to Canada. Like, is CDA really apprised of this challenge and issue? And webinars like this will certainly help. But what's happening at the global level that you're aware of?
So yeah, well, there's an international working group of HTA agencies, that includes some of the usual suspects, some of the European agencies, and Canada and Australia, that have been working together to set up sort of the guidelines around how to assess treatments that use surrogate endpoints. Slow moving, and I don't want to cast any doom and gloom around this right now. I mean, when you look at some of the data that IQVIA generated, where they did an analysis of drugs that have been assessed by here in Canada by CDA, where surrogate endpoints were a primary endpoint, it's a mixed message. I mean, it wasn't. It's there's been approvals and there's been denials. There's been a negative reimbursements, but it hasn't been overwhelmingly concerning yet. But the point is that it's a slow moving for them to adapt to it and to develop policies around this. It has been slow moving, and frankly, that's where I see a lot of the role of patient groups as well, is to try to accelerate that work, not just to say, that they blindly have to accept all these surrogate endpoints as, as proof points, but just to keep moving quickly, because again, this is just like everything else we've been working on recently. Patients can't wait. This is very similar to the other agenda that we're working on right now, trying to accelerate access to treatments, that are getting slowed down through the negotiation process and the implementation process. We're a bit earlier in the process here, but it's all about accelerating access to treatments, and we constantly have to put pressure on the system. And that's where I think a lot of this work that we're doing today and presenting today is helping to add those pressures.
Yeah. And Stephanie, I'm sure you saw it too, because it was really quite different in the lay media, but the lay sort of quasi-academic media too. The Economist had the front page of The Economist that we're slowly winning the war of attrition against cancer. And that reminded me a lot about what you said about when you first started your practice. You had a handful of treatments, and now, I mean, you're going to ASCO and ESMO and elsewhere, and then coming back and saying, there's a plethora of potential options that we could maybe bring to bear on this. The challenge for evaluators and funders is, okay, what and in which circumstances should we give you access to the broader range of medicines that you think would help in this given circumstance? So when you're in the clinic and you're dealing with a new patient that came in, and you've got the pathology, you've got an idea of what you might want to do, are you, I mean, you're looking at everything as possible. Are you working on getting them on a clinical trial, and that way that'll get them the best access? Is that number one for you? And then number two, okay, let's go to the funded algorithms and get you on that. What's your decision on when you get that kind of situation, which is probably most days?
Absolutely. So, I mean, this is something you deal with every day. I can look at the, pathology, the patient's past history and imaging, and I know within a second what the best medicine is. The challenge that I have to do every day is, how do I get my hands on that medicine? And so I participate in tons of clinical interventional research trials, and not just for the purpose of, moving forward the science, but sometimes just to get access for my patients. Because if I put you on the trial, there's a 50-50 chance you're going to get something. Because the moral injury we face every day is real. Just in my clinic yesterday, I had 2 patients back to back. Very similar age, very similar patients in every other respect, other than the fact that one is married to someone from the Navy here in Halifax. So they have beautiful federal Canada Life coverage. The other one has regular Pharmacare Nova Scotia coverage. They have the exact same mutation. One of them has now been 2 years on a targeted therapy with minimal side effects and living her best life. The other one does not have access. This drug would cost out of pocket about between $10,000 and $12,000 a month, and they just cannot afford that. And so they're getting chemotherapy with toxicities and with clearly inferior efficacy. And it really is hurtful. If they start talking in the waiting room, there's one of them's going to be really upset. They're like, why can't you get that drug for me? And sometimes it's not just delayed. Sometimes our drugs are truly shut down. And so that's one of the challenges that we face. If we're going to start seeing funding recommendations on surrogate endpoints, there's often a lot less certainty around the benefit. And when there's less certainty in the economic models, that leads to much larger confidence intervals. And hence, when those drugs are even recommended for funding, as we all know, that doesn't mean it's going to come to a jurisdiction. The next step is negotiation. And one of the more heartbreaking things that we see as clinicians, drugs that are so good and we work so hard and we get them through HT and they have a positive recommendation for funding, and then they die at PCPA, which is, of course, the negotiation process, because sometimes of the uncertainty, they just cannot come up with a price that's going to be acceptable to the pharmaceutical company, and we never, ever get access to those drugs. And then they're essentially dead drugs. And so the uncertainty is something we're also going to have to deal with in order to make sure that if we are moving forward at the HTA level of CDA and NS, getting positive recommendations, that PCPA is also equipped and empowered to take those decisions and be able to move that into a negotiation with more certainty. But yeah, we beg, we cry, we do everything we can. We come up with real world data. We ask for compassionate access. We talk about sometimes, do you want to move to another province? Like, do you have an aunt that you can move in with? Because, you know, that province has access to a drug and we don't. And do you happen to have an uncle who's Mr. Sobey or Mr. Irving, of course, very, very wealthy families in Atlantic Canada, who might be able to pay for this drug for you? I never assume that everyone is not a billionaire until I actually ask them, because maybe people can afford these out of pocket, but unfortunately, most of them can't. And so that's what gets us so worked up and energized for our work in patient advocacy.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephanie. And that's actually probably a good segue to our next CanCertainty webinar that we're looking at doing, Bob, because we're going to actually review the FAST system that's coming out of Ontario and hopefully at the national level, where they're going to fund first while negotiations are ongoing. And maybe even by the final CDA recommendation, we're going to have funded access, which would just be incredible. Right now, it's just for Project Orbis drugs, the ones that go through the joint regulatory reviews. But that's something that we're going to see. We have one question, and I know we're going to go a little bit over time here, but this is being recorded, so I know people will have to drop off. Come back and listen to the panelists' discussion of this. The FMEC program at the Canada's Drug Agency. FMEC stands for Formulary Modernization Evaluation Committee, and that's really the trial ground or the pilot project opportunity by CDA to try things differently than they would otherwise. They only review medicines that have been non-sponsored by a pharmaceutical company. So one of the jurisdictions has to say, okay, this is the combination or this is the new indication that I really want that expert review committee to review. And the questioner notes that there's one patient representative that's been asked to speak there. Would that be able to reflect the heterogeneous perspectives sufficiently? Yeah, what do you think, Sheila and Bob? And
I mean, I think having one person in the room is better than having no people in the room. But I think that unless we can arm that one individual with credible efforts to understand the variety of patient experiences, we can't expect that they would do any better. So I think, you know, to Bob's point about creating dissemination materials, like, let's do the research. And if there's only going to be one person, give them all the information they need to speak well in that situation.
excellent.
Stephanie,
Yeah.
Bob, did you have anything you wanted to say on
Yeah,
that?
I mean, and also I think you know, I think these materials that we are generating, whether we develop them slightly different though, I mean, we can do a lot more to actually educate some of the reviewers and the officials that are working in HTA. I mean, there's, you know, this you know, we definitely want to equip patients. That's the mandate of CanCertainty, but we also want to I think try to, you know, shape policy at the HTA level as well, so we can do a lot directed at those people up front, so that it doesn't always rely on the one patient to try to do the education.
Last thing I would mention, these patients don't usually just like drop out of the sky and end up in front of the committee. They have to come from somewhere. And so both as my role as a clinician, but also with a leadership position in patient advocacy groups, they're probably someone who's probably pretty involved anyway. I mean, they're probably already involved in their advocacy group for their tumor type if it exists and those types of things. So for instance, a lung cancer thing, and somebody from Lung Cancer Canada was going, when we knew about it, we'd make sure that they knew the breadth of the perspectives and they had a chance to talk to other patients who are involved in the organization before they win. And so it's just like Sheila said, giving them the skills and the tools that they need to speak on behalf of a full group, not just themselves.
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. And talking about heterogeneity, it's also different cancers have different tracks in terms of likelihood of faster mortality. I think of glioblastoma, for instance. I mean, the you know, the 6-month survival rates are pretty grim, let alone 5 years. And Stephanie, I just would hope that more cancers are going to experience what lung has experienced more recently. And because you're going to have people with the experience in all the different medicines to be able to actually advocate later. Some of the really hard to treat cancers don't have that yet. But the more we do this, the more survivors we're going to have, the more patients and patient representatives are going to be able to play that role at FMEC. And here I am pretending I'm a panelist. I'm really sorry for weighing in there. I shouldn't. But this has been such an honor to help direct traffic today. We've gone a bit over time, but like we're making an HBO show or something like that. We don't have to do it exactly this amount of time for this many commercials. So I really thank the folks that have stayed on the line a little bit extra, but the recording will be up in case you want to catch the last few minutes in this last bit of discussion. Bob, any last words to you?
Yeah, just thank you very much, Stephanie and Sheila, for the excellent presentations today. Very helpful for the patient community, and to the patient groups that are on the line today. Stay tuned for the package of information that we're going to prepare for you to help with your submissions, and stay tuned for the next announcement on the upcoming webinar about the various programs across Canada about accelerating access to medications. We're going to try to untangle the whole pile of different things that have been happening over the last year about accelerating access and try to provide clarity and focus on that. So thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Sheila. Special thanks to you for always unpacking the acronyms. That was a really good job. Like all the different PFS, OS, all of that. That was excellent. I think a lot of the folks on the line appreciate that, and it's been great moderating this webinar. We'll see you again soon. Take care, everybody. Happy Thanksgiving. So much to be thankful for. I'm thankful for CanCertainty and great people like you on this mission with me. Thanks very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.